Lord, I love the house in which you dwell and the place where your glory abides. That's what the psalmist says in today's psalm. Jesus, who came and pitched his tent among us, lived among us, and died as one of us, dwelt on this earth. And when our hearts are open to God, we know that God has always lived among us. Back in the Garden of Eden, remember that story in the very first book in the Bible, God has a habit of walking in the garden in the cool of the evening. And in the closing book of the New Testament, Revelation, God once more comes and dwells with us after ridding the earth of the evil that has held it in thrall for so long. See, the writer of Revelation proclaims, see, the home of God is among mortals. God will dwell with us, and we will be God's peoples. And God will be with us and wipe every tear from our eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying will be no more. Pain will be no more. For the first things have passed away. So we live in the time of God with us now, and yet not fully. And we know that truly the earth itself is a house of the Lord. For God is not only transcendent and heavenly, but also immanent, as near to us as the air we breathe, as refreshing and as life-giving to us as the water we drink, as restoring as the rain after a long drought, and as solid as the rocky mantle that supports the soil and all of life on this earth. So Jesus came and dwelt among us so that we could see with our own eyes that God has always dwelt in our midst on this earth, which is not only God's footstool, as the psalmist says, but the very body of God, as theologian Sally McFague would say. We earth dwellers live and move and have our being within the body of God during our lives on this earth. And so when we truly open our eyes, we can see for ourselves God's glory abiding all around us. That is a revolutionary thought, that we live within the body of God. Lord, I love the house in which you dwell and the place where your glory abides. God's glory, so intricately woven into the fabric of this earth and the entire universe. So we rejoice in hope, even as we look around and see God's glory diminished by the ways in which we abuse and mistreat one another. And even when we look around and truly begin to see the ways in which we have been both intentionally and unintentionally oblivious and negligent, greedy and selfish in the ways in which we relate to God's earth, we can still rejoice in hope. When Jesus told the disciples that they must take up their crosses and follow him, he was hopeful. Jesus told the disciples that the next part of his journey would be difficult and would include suffering and death. But beyond the suffering and death was resurrection. So Jesus was hopeful that the disciples could see beyond the grim predictions of the now, and we have here plenty of grim predictions of the now, into the hope of the resurrection life of the not yet. This resurrection life included the time that they were spending with Jesus, because in being with him, the disciples were learning about what resurrection life is in the here and now. So when Jesus told the disciples that they must take up their crosses and follow him, he was hopeful that they would do so despite the cost. Now, this Sunday is the first Sunday in the season of creation. We can take up our crosses as followers of Jesus in the context of how we Christians live faithfully in a climate that is quickly changing and bringing about irreversible changes to the earth. We human beings have an impact on our climate in just about everything we do, both positive and negative. And our life together in the church can be both positive and negative in terms of climate change. So I'd like to share with you today this very hopeful story about the church in Ethiopia, so that you can draw inspiration from it as we consider our individual relationships with the earth, particularly our own place here on the banks of the Rappahannock. For right now, we are the caretakers of this little part of God's dwelling. So let's go to Ethiopia, which is a country in Africa. That whole country used to be covered with lush forest, full of biodiversity. These forests vanished as the land has become cleared for farming and cattle grazing, especially since the 1970s. A lot of the forests were removed for farming. But about 35,000 acres of small oases of forest are left, and they dot the countryside, and in almost every case, a church rests right in the middle of that forest. More of half of the Ethiopians belong to the Orthodox Tewahedo Church, and they view their natural forest as a symbol of heaven on earth, where every creature is a gift from God and needs a habitat, as Allison Abbott states in her article about these church forests in the publication Nature. The priests and the people consider that the forest is an extension of the church. The forest itself is the house in which God dwells. Now, this collaboration with people and with scientists who are working with the church to save the forest is a sign of hope for the journey for all. For in their communion with the sacred, the people are working together for the common good, not just for themselves, but for God's creation. See, this is what's happened there. All started by one person, which is so often the case, that one person has a vision and then carries it forward with help from others. Alimehu Wasi grew up in Ethiopia, so he grew up there. He loved the forest, and so he became a forest ecologist. He teaches ecology now in Germany. And as he learned more about these small pockets of forest and all the different creatures that live there, he realized that these bits of forest were very quickly disappearing, because what happens is that the cattle graze on the edges of the forest, and they go into the forest and trample the undergrowth, and the forest slowly keeps receding. So Wasi began actively working to save these last small bits of forest in his country. He says that the church forest became his profession and also his emotional and spiritual connection. So his first task in working to help to save the forest was to convince the priests that protecting their forest was vital, because the villagers, as I said, although they respected the forest, would let their cattle go into the forest, and sometimes their plows would damage the edges of the forest. So Wasi had to educate the priest. They let him enter the forest to count the various species there, but they didn't understand why he was doing the work. They couldn't see any advantage to themselves or the community regarding actively preserving their forest. And so then, here comes modern technology. Wasi showed them their forest on Google Maps. Have y'all ever used Google Maps where you can zoom in on something? So he showed them how it's all brown and kind of a brown landscape, and then here's this beautiful oasis, and the zoom comes in and you see the round church right in the middle, surrounded by the trees. It's really stunning. And so he showed them that. And they realized that they had something special with the forest still around them. So He wanted to convince them to actively preserve the forests, not just because they're considered sacred space, but also because of all the birds and insects that the forest supports. For these birds and insects play an important part still in fertilizing the crops and also for pest control in the country. And the forests also absorb carbon, conserve water, reduce soil erosion, and provide natural medicine. They also, for the local population and the priests, provide shelter, space for worship, contemplation and prayer, and that's where their burial areas are, in the forest. So Wasi became very discouraged because he was finding funding difficult and local collaboration was hard. But then at an international conference in Mexico, he met another forest ecologist, Meg Lohman, who was moved by his despair. She joined him in his work, and they began raising money and working to win the trust of the priest and the church. Now, once the priests realized that part of their mission was to actively protect their forest, they began to enlist the local population to help them build walls around the forest. So teams of people come together. They gather rocks out of their fields, which helps them too, because then they have an easier time for crop production. And then they take those rocks and they build walls that allow people to go in and out of the forest, but they keep the cattle out. So the parts of the floor that have been, forest floor that have been trampled start to regenerate, and the health of the forest improves. So I think it's about 40 now of these churches have walls around their forest. In another article in the publication Emergence, Jeffrey Seifert and photographer Fred Manson write about the mystical geography of these forests in northern Ethiopia. I highly recommend that you read this very beautiful and inspiring piece of writing and see a few of the dramatic images from Google Earth that I referred to that help convince the priests to work to preserve their forest. You can find those links on the website if you look there. Now, the story of Alimehu Wasi's work and the priests and the local people working together to save the forest is a story of taking up a cross while rejoicing in hope. So on this first Sunday of the season of creation, based on today's lessons, consider how your understanding of the earth shifts when you imagine it as God's dwelling, a dwelling that God gracefully invites us to share. Look for God's glory glowing around us, if only we have eyes to see. And think about how taking up your cross when you engage with the environment can cause you to rejoice in hope, even when you're tempted to give in to despair. And let's consider how we as the church can take up the crosses waiting for us in our own place and time and work together with one another and with the broader community for the good of the earth. Lord, I love the house in which you dwell and the place where your glory abides.